NFL season made me want to pull my hair out. It was so much that happened, and it was such a brutal week all over the place. Not only there so many bust performances. There was players that we faded in week one that ended up getting busy. There are players that broke out. There were gems that just disappointed. There are things that we just didn't understand. Players that we got right, players we got wrong on, players that we didn't start, that we regret starting today. I mean, that we regret not starting today. And it was a lot, but the focal point of week two in my mind was the injuries. There were a ton of injuries, especially since we were already dealing with the injury bug in week one. Those injuries are important because they shift the landscape and they also make you have to go search the waiver wire and ask yourself, who do I want to add to my roster so that I can stay afloat and also be competitive to win my fantasy football championship and get in position to do so. On this episode of Fantasy Vibes, we're going to be breaking down the week three waiver wire targets that you need to be adding to your rosters for the NFL season and in fantasy football. And before we get there, make sure you hit that like button, thumbs up this video, and also share it with somebody that you love. And deeper than that, consider subscribing to the channel so you never miss an upload, so you stay up to date with all the fantasy insight and content that we're giving you, and you never miss an episode of Fantasy Vibes, hosted by me, MoonVibes. And this episode is called Ride This Wave, week three, waiver wire. Let's get into it. Coming up first, rostered in 51% of leagues, Justin Fields, Chicago Bears. There's not a lot to say. I already said a lot over the previous episodes. Justin Fields came in relief duty of Andy Dalton, who had an injury on a non-contact play where he scrambled out to the right side, tried to go out of bounds, and he just like landed awkwardly. And he tried to come back into the game, but it wasn't really. It didn't last long. He ended up going out, and Justin Fields came in the second quarter. Justin Fields tossed 60 yards. He had an interception. And the bright side is that he had 31 yards rushing, which is great. He had really limited practice time this week, and we can only expect that he's going to get more comfortable with time, especially when he's taking reps with the starters. I look for this chemistry with Darnell Mooney, Allen Robinson, the offensive line, even the other playmakers that they have in their offense, like David Montgomery and David Williams, to increase when Justin Fields is in there. And that's going to increase with more reps they get in practice. Now, the reason why Justin Fields needs to be added is beyond just passing volume. We saw that he targeted Allen Robinson a couple of different times, Darnell Mooney as well. The other reason is because of rushing upside and rushing volume. He clearly has that, and he's kind of reminds me of the same mode as like a Jalen Hurts or a Lamar Jackson or a Josh Allen, Kyler Murray, who as a quarterback you have the tools to be great passers. However, your rushing upside is what's going to help us in fantasy so much. He's a player that you need to be adding to your rosters, and if you already have, give yourself a pat on the back because you listen, and now you're ahead of the curve. Coming up next, rostered in 19% of leagues, Daniel Jones, 249 passing yards, 95 rushing yards against Washington football team, and he found the end zone twice. If I include that 58-yard rushing touchdown that got called back in the second quarter because of a holding penalty, he would have himself a day. Probably finishes the number one quarterback in fantasy against the tough defense in the Washington football team. He's a highlight, and I understand. You're like, why do I need to pick up Daniel Jones? Well, what if I told you that this week he takes on the Atlanta Falcons, who are a gold mine for fantasy for their defense. And anytime you play them, you can just expect the quarterback to just go crazy. Danny Dimes, only 19% roster, taking on the Atlanta Falcons, who just gave up 5 touchdowns from Tom Brady this past week and let Jalen Hurts get busy in week one. Definitely consider Danny Dimes in your roster this week. Other players to consider. We got Teddy Bridgewater at 17% for the New York Jets. Derek Carr with 26% versus Miami. And Taylor Heineke at 4% versus Buffalo. He had 2 tough matchups already against the Ravens defense and against the Pittsburgh Steelers defense. And he showed up. He's averaging 400 yards passing per game. That just shows you that Derek Carr is not this our thought process on Derek Carr and what the actual reality is not matching and not adding up. And it's because of our perspective. We need to shift our perspective on Derek Carr and pick him up in any format that you can right now. 26% rostered against Miami. This offense has the potential to be really, really good this year for Las Vegas. Let's get into the running backs. Probably at the top of my list is running backs is rostered in 51% of the leagues right now. It's Tony Pollard. This situation with Tony Pollard and Ezekiel Elliott is messy. It's not the messiest in the league, but yeah, Zeke right now, as an owner, you kind of got to be a little bit nervous. The reason why is because in week 1, Ezekiel Elliott saw 84% of the snaps compared to Tony Pollard's 20%. Last week, we saw Ezekiel Elliott against the Chargers have 72% of the snaps and Tony Pollard have 35%. Now, he's not a replacement for Ezekiel Elliott. He's more like a handcuff plus, I would call it. But both running backs need to be rostered in your leagues. It's not really complicated. Now, I don't think that it's time to jump ship from Ezekiel Elliott, but it's clear that Kellen Moore and this Cowboys and Mike McCarthy and this Cowboys offense looks to get both of these runners involved in the game. And Tony Pollard had himself a great game. He carried 13 times, actually 3 less carries than Ezekiel Elliott. He had 109 yards and he had a score on Sunday. He also added PPR value by having 3 catches for 31 yards. Only rostered in 51%. It makes sense to add Tony Pollard to your roster. Coming up next, James White, New England Patriots. Let's just be honest, 41%. James White, why do I need to add him, Moon? Well, because he continues to be a fantasy football asset. He led the Patriots in targets, catches, and receiving yards from the running back position through week 2. He has 12 catches on 13 targets this season, ladies and gentlemen. He did rush 5 times for 20 yards, and he had a score as well this week against the New York Jets. And he's also presented some value as a runner for you. Cordell Patterson, Atlanta Falcons. Arthur Smith seems to be adamant about using the hot hand. And in the game against the Bucs, Cordell Patterson had the hot hand. Cordell Patterson rushed for 7 carries, 11 yards. You might, that's not impressive. But what is impressive is the fact that he had 5 catches for 58 yards and a nice touchdown score that just was absolutely beautiful to watch. Now, I know the performance may have seemed a little bit shaky and a little bit fluky in week 1, but he got both of the red zone carries in week 2 for this offense. That is important, getting green zone work and green zone carries. 16 touches to 12. He's definitely an asset that you need to add on your waiver wire, and I would be highly upset if you didn't take a chance on Cordell Patterson. Deeper than me just being a Falcons fan. He's actually good as a running back. Other running backs that you need to consider in order of importance. Starting at the bottom, Demetric Felton, rostered in less than 1% of the leagues. Coming up next, J.D. McKissick in 29% of the leagues for the Washington football team. Philip Lindsay at 39% for the Houston Texans. Zach Moss for the Buffalo Bills at 49%, and Sony Michel coming in at 60% for the Los Angeles Rams. Now, let's get to the wide receivers. Coming up first, KJ Osborne, Minnesota Vikings, rostered in 2% of leagues. Now, I understand when you first turned on this Arizona Cardinals versus Minnesota Vikings game, you had no chance but to feel like it was going to be a shootout, and it was going to be, if you picked the over in this game, you were going to be greatly rewarded because it was an offensive fireworks show. And it got started and popped off because KJ Osborne got busy. Now, I understand you might be looking at it like, well, if you take away that 64-yard score, he didn't really do much. But he did. He actually leads the Vikings in total receiving through two games. That's with Justin Jefferson and Adam Thielen on the same team. Now, he showcased that he's ready to be a part of this offense as the number 3 guy in the slot. He had 6 targets that were 3rd on the entire team, and he racked up 91 yards and a score on the day against the Arizona Cardinals. We have to look at this and say, hey, KJ, 2% of the leagues, I guarantee you that will be higher in a couple of weeks from now. Mark it, book it. KJ Osborne, need to target him in the Minnesota Vikings passing attack. Coming up next, Henry Ruggs, Las Vegas Raiders, 35%. That through 2 weeks, no one in the NFL has more passing yards than Derek Carr. That showcases the upside in volume. He's actually 128 yards over what Kyler Murray's passing yard total is. In week 2, at least, they've had 37 passes to 25 rushes against the Pittsburgh Steelers. A game that not a lot of people picked them to win. And that is encouraging even when Josh Jacobs was not involved in his passing game. He didn't play at all. Kenyon Drake played. Did you know that Henry Ruggs had 12 targets on Sunday, and that tied the team lead with Darren Waller and Hunter Renfrow? The week after, Darren Waller just got 19 targets. There's no debating that Darren Waller is the focal point of this offense. However, Henry Ruggs is needed in this offense just as much because he stretches the field vertically, and that is needed in this offense. Somebody that you need to consider in 35% of the leagues. And last but not least, probably the biggest one of the wide receivers, probably in the whole fantasy slate, is Rondale Moore. He only played in 46% of the team snaps on Sunday, but he had 8 targets for 7 catches or 114 receiving yards in the entire. And he kind of broke the internet. Rondale Moore literally broke the internet. This passing game for the Arizona Cardinals, beyond just passing game, their whole offense is just probably the most fun and exciting offense to watch in the league. And you have Kyler Murray passing you the ball with DeAndre Hopkins and AJ Green. Now you got to add Rondale Moore in the mix because he's going to be utilized. And you're like, Moon, can that performance be duplicated? Well, I can make you convinced that it will when I tell you that. Guess who the Arizona Cardinals take on this week? The Jacksonville Jaguars and their defense to consider. Other wide receivers to consider. Brian Edwards at 20%. He could have had a touchdown that got called back in this previous week. He could have had a touchdown. He got called back on a penalty. Elijah Moore. I understand that Zach Wilson was atrocious this past week. Elijah Moore still has value. He's in 32% of leagues. Darnell Mooney at 45%. With the emergence of Justin Fields into the starting quarterback position, it only elevates just Darnell Mooney even more. I call him Donnell. Tim Patrick rewarded us this past week. He's 22% roster, going up slightly, but he got to score, so you got to be happy about that. Zach Pascal got to score too for the Colts. He rewarded us as well if you pick Zach Pascal, 15% of leagues. Quez Watkins probably had the number 2 receiving total out of the entire league this past week, so he's definitely got to be on the list. He's only in 1% of leagues. 1%. Do not fade Jalen Reagor. If you have Jalen Reagor, do not fade him. He could have had a score, but it got called back in that game. And last but not least, Darius Slayton at 4% right now. Definitely need to add, consider adding these players to your rosters for the wide receiver position. Coming up next, I have a tight end that I want to talk about, and he kind of impressed me a lot. But before I do, if you're enjoying this video, make sure you hit that like button. Make sure you consider subscribing and share with somebody that you love so you can put somebody on the fantasy vibes on what's going on over here. Tight ends. Max Williams, Arizona Cardinals. If you're playing with Kyler Murray, I kind of want you on my fantasy team at this point because there's going to be a lot of volume. Week 1 was a weird week that left us all kind of like confused when it comes to Max Williams. He was on the field for 80% of the snaps, but he only got 1 target and it wasn't even caught. Now, when you talked about the matchup against Minnesota, you were like, man, do I need to trust Max Williams? Well, if you didn't, you were sadly mistaken. In a shootout against Minnesota, he hauled in 7 catches for 7 targets, perfect efficiency. And he had 94 receiving yards, and he did all of that without scoring. He actually had 7 targets that outpaced DeAndre Hopkins, and he only trailed the guy that we talked about earlier, Rondale Moore, in targets for this offense. Even though he doesn't find the end zone, it's encouraging that he's being used in this way after the disappointing week 1. And when you have Kyler Murray as your fantasy quarterback, or your quarterback in general, why not take a chance on Max Williams? He's a deeper league guy in the tight end position that could be used this year and could have an impact. Other tight ends that you need to consider is also Dawson Knox of the Buffalo Bills, who got in the end zone this week for the Bills passing attack, and Jack Doyle for the Indianapolis Colts, who's rostered in 1% of the leagues. Dawson Knox is 6% of the leagues. Those are some of the waiver wire ads that you need to target on your rosters this week and why you need to target them and add them to your rosters. Fantasy football is heating up. Let's just be honest. This is week 3. There's a lot that's going on, especially with all these injuries. You want to take some chances on some of these guys that I mentioned, and hopefully we can come back next week and say, hey, where we were right, where we were wrong, and some of these players won't even be on your waiver wire anymore. Go ahead and scoop them up. Go ahead and target them. I am your host, MoonVibes. This is Fantasy Vibes. And this is Ride This Wave, a special segment dedicated to the waiver wire targets that you need to add to your rosters and why you need to add them to your rosters. We got some dogs, and probably at the top of the list, probably Rondale Moore of the Arizona Cardinals, Justin Fields. Shout out to you if you already got Justin Fields on your roster. And with that being said, we out of here. We're going to see you on the next episode. Make sure you kick that like button. Consider subscribing to the channel so you never miss an upload. And for me, MoonVibes, I'm sending you off into your day. Enjoy it and live it up. Stay wavy like I always say. And until next time, this is Fantasy Vibes.